South and Latin American independence, specifically looking at the idea of what caused the wars of liberation in Latin America. You'll see in Schoology, there's an article by Keene and Haynes called The History of Latin America. And what we're going to do is focus in that text on three areas very similar to what we did to North America, of looking at what were the elements of independence. Now, the thing that gets a little difficult with this is that it was varied, because if you look at Mexico versus Colombia versus the Dominican, you have very different cultures that grew out of these colonial experiences with mainly the Spanish, but also the French. And so I'm going to kind of be generalized, but then also specifically look at areas where there were key differences. So first of all, society. This is kind of just a generalization of the way that the caste system generally grew out of different colonial areas. And we'll look a little specifically at how this changed and how it was varied in different places. But typically, it was broken down into peninsulares, creoles, and then the kind of lower class, which had divisiveness between itself as far as where on the level that they were in the kind of economic and social background. You had the castas, the Amerindians, the mestizos, Black Americans, and women, typically at the bottom of most Latin American societies. Many were forced into pretty hardcore labor in the mines or on ranches or large-scale plantations. But this became a big divisiveness when we look at like who's going to do a lot of the fighting and the leading. So the peninsulares were typically your European-born colonial leaders, and they were the ones that were being pushed out by the creoles, who wanted to have more control over their government rather than just maintaining the economic upward level that they had. They had Spanish blood, but they were born in the Americas, and that was the real dividing point. So economically, how this played out was that in most of Latin America, you had this kind of reluctance or this slow growth in a merchant society or industrial society. A lot of it was all farming and commodity based. You had large scale economías. I can't pronounce that right, but they were like large haciendas, self-sufficient farms that depended on a lot of the foreign countries for their manufacturing. So the economic output, and this is one of the things that prevented a real strong, balanced independence movement in most Latin American states, was that they were so focused on commodities and the ownership of the land where those commodities came from, that you definitely would always have these Creole leaders really pushing for this independence and promising freedom to a lot of the lower level caste members. And then they never were really given it, because obviously that was then going to give up on their working class. So some examples of this, how it politically played out a little differently, was like in Mexico, you have this, kind of Declaration of Independence, the Grito de Dolores, the Cry of Dolores, was Miguel Hidalgo's proclamation of revolution in Mexico, which turned out to be not entirely successful. There was an independence movement of Spain, but at the time, if you look at the bottom point there, a lot of the Spanish colonies were in disarray because Napoleon had taken over Spain and Portugal and basically given the throne and all the colonial powers to his brother, Joseph Bonaparte. So when these colonies are rising up against Spain, they're really not rising up against Spain. They're rising up against a French-controlled Spain. And then one of the interesting ones, which we'll talk a little bit more in depth at the end of the trimester, is Toussaint Louverture, who was the leader of the slave revolution in Haiti. And so we see kind of this unique difference of this Spanish-controlled versus French-controlled colony. In this French-controlled colony, you have a slave revolution. So the actual movement came from the bottom level of the caste, the slave caste. And here, interestingly, we'll look a little bit about how that caste system was very different in Haiti, especially to other Spanish colonies, and how that played out politically. So ultimately, you would just want to know that you want to pay attention to the country. You don't want to lump in all of Latin America. A lot of the reasons, again, were very similar to those socioeconomic, beliefs of wanting that kind of independence, led often by the wealthiest creoles, using the lower workers to basically fight against that colonial leadership. There's a little clip here that we'll watch in class from the crash course that goes through this idea and these ideas. You can watch that on your own. It is linked in the Schoology page. But for right now, that's about it. I want you to just focus on this idea of kind of putting those political, social, and economic ideas into building an understanding of individual independence movements throughout South, Central, and America and the Caribbean.